And this sleep itself, it's ensured many of the rahmahs, many of the ease for them all. This sleep itself was very special and a great source of rahmah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were sleeping not just like you and I sleep. They were going to sleep for 3 centuries. In order for them to be able to sleep for that long period of time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He put some certain mechanisms in place. I will mention some of these mechanisms in brief about what Allah did to ensure that they would remain sound and safe during that period. Number 1, sleep for such a long period of time harms and eventually decays the body. It's going to harm the body for 300 years. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although they were in the state of sleep, Allah ensured that every so often they would turn, just like you and I do, left to the right, right to the left. وَنُقَلِّبُهُمْ ذَاتَ الْيَمِينِ وَذَاتَ الشِّمَالِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ensuring that they were turning from one side to the other. Otherwise, like Ibn Kathir, like Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu states, that if they hadn't turned over for that prolonged period of time, the earth would have consumed them. Medically speaking, this is exactly the same practice which has been adopted in this day and age as well. When you have patients who are in hospital for a prolonged period of time, for example in a state of coma, or for terminally ill patients, for very ill patients, individuals who are going to be in their bed for a very long period of time, the doctors and nurses, they always ensure that these patients, they are moved from side to side every couple of hours. If they don't, then they end up with a condition and a disease called pressure ulcer. Pressure ulcer, please don't look at it on Google later. I suggest you not. It's a horrible disease. It creates a lot of mold and bacteria onto your skin. It's a horrible thing if a body remains in one particular state for a long period of time. That's what happens if you stay in one state. In order for them not to be subject to these diseases and illnesses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ensured that their body was flipping from one side to another without ruining their sleep either throughout those 309 years. The rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 2, when a person sleeps, then the one organ that remains active during that time are the hearing organs. That a person can still hear. That is why that is why you have alarm clocks. They're audio, aren't they? If you had an alarm clock which was visual only and no sound to it, would you wake up in the morning? No, of course not. Every single alarm clock that has ever existed is audible, isn't it? Why? The whole point of an alarm clock is to wake you up through the ears. That's the only way you are going to wake up. Think about it yourself. Over a 309-year period, there's bound to be lots of noise in and around that cave. You know, when we get to sleep for 9 hours, there's noise going on. Imagine for 309 years. As you can imagine, if you're sleeping for that long period of time, every single noise, every single animal going past, every single rumble of the thunder, for example, it will wake you up. How did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ensure that they would remain asleep for 309 years? فَضَرَبْنَا عَلَىٰ آذَانِهِمْ فِي الْكَهْفِ سِنِينَ عَدَدًا. Basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ensured that their ears were covered so they could not hear anything. That protected their sleep as well. It ensured that they could remain asleep for all of that time. Number 3, وَتَحْسَبُهُمْ أَيْقَاظًا وَهُمْ رُقُودٌ. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states that you would have thought that, Ya Rasulullah, if you had seen them, you would have thought that they were awake. In reality, they were asleep. These are the words of the Quran. You would think that they were awake, but in reality, they were asleep. What does this mean? Well, what does it mean by you would think that they were awake? It could possibly mean because they were turning from left to right every so often. They weren't obviously dead. A lot of the ulama ikram from the classics, they have written that what this means is that when they went to sleep, Allah ensured that their eyes remained open. That their eyes didn't actually close. For the reason that He perhaps knows best. And the Mufassirin write that this was better to ensure their preservation so that there was no medical problems with them. Otherwise, normally, when you and I go to sleep, we have to have our eyes closed. Even when a deceased passes away, then we shut the eyes, the muscles stop working, we ensure that their eyes are shut. When you and I are asleep, then the eyes have to remain closed so that the process of cleaning continues. The tears, basically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, perhaps as a karam, He said that I am going to protect their eyes even with their eyes open during this prolonged period. My thanks to Dr. Zira Qatari Sahab, who explained all of this to me only a couple of hours ago, and why medically this is something that is interesting and perhaps we will learn later as well in our lives. Perhaps medical science hasn't caught up with the Quranic science. But suffice to say, for now, the verse itself says, you thought, if you had looked at them, you would have thought that they were awake. In reality, they were asleep. The interpretations I have given to you. The fourth point regarding how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put them to sleep. The sun would come, and the way that the sun was located, the cave was located in relation to the sun, also ensured their comfort, health and ease. What are we told about this? The verse indicates that the entrance to the cave, it faced to north. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when the sun was rising, then the sunlight used to enter the cave from the right hand side. So we know that the cave, the entrance to it was facing the north. Ibn Abbas, Mujahid and Qatada said that turning away from them means that the sun, subhanallah, it would shine on them, but it would leave them at the same time. Meaning that they were getting the calcium, or they were getting all of the goodness that you get from the sun. But at the same time, sometimes, the sun, when it shines on you, then it can wake you up as well. Allah ensured it in such a way that they would get the benefit from it, but no harm whatsoever. So you could say that for them in particular, the sun, it took on special qualities just for them. Again, the karama of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His miracle, this itself is a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are just some of the things. Also, we know as well that the temperature inside the cave, it remained constant. It does not change. This is something which is true of all caves. And this is something that perhaps we can talk about later at the end, that we went to, this was only a couple of months ago, it's a beautiful part of this country, it's called a place called Heights of Abraham. It's in Derbyshire. I would strongly suggest with your youngsters, in order to see the countryside of this country, please go to places like this. It's a beautiful cable car over near the Peak District, beautiful scenery. As part of that site, there were caves there. And myself and Aisha, we went there, we went into the cave, dark, very gloomy, very quite interesting place. We went there and we asked the person, and so somebody mentioned it to me earlier, Samir mentioned this to me. We asked the person who works in the cave, we said, we have heard that whatever the temperature outside the cave, the temperature inside the cave always remains the same, it is always constant. And he said, this is true. If it is winter outside or summer, it doesn't make any difference to the temperature inside. It remains more or less constant. So this itself was a great rahmah for the Aṣḥāb kahf as well. It was never too cold for them, it was never too hot. The temperature remained constant. Can you think of how many different weather changes might have happened in that 300-year period outside the cave? None of them affected that. They remained preserved from that. Again, it was the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.